and is not only a very distinguished academic who's been director of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew and scientific director of the Eden Project in Cornwall, and is visiting professor at Reading University, and has held academic posts in the United States, spent many years on field work in the Amazonian Brazil, and has a worldwide interest in the sustainable development of rainforest ecosystems and conservation. So I think this is a lifelong passion. He has published 19 books, has edited another 16, and over 590 papers on plant systematics, plant ecology, ethnobotany and conservation. He's also a fellow of the Royal Society, was awarded the International Cosmos Prize for his environmental work in the Amazon, and has held numerous posts at universities and other foundations overseas and here in the UK. And as well as all that, he's a deacon at Lyme Regis Baptist Church, and is also a patron, one of our patrons, a patron of Green Christian. So it's our enormous privilege to have you here this morning, Ghillean, and we're looking forward very much to hearing what you have to say. As ever, please everybody put your speaker thing, your view on speaker view, and mute yourselves, make sure you're muted. And this session is being recorded. So Ghillean, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you, Deborah, very much for that kind introduction. First of all, may I say what a privilege it is, and I am very glad that Green Christian has arranged this festival at such a difficult time, a strange time in our midst at the moment. So it's been a joy to me to take part in everything that's gone so far. Thank you especially to the organizers and to Barbara for your part in it, and Barbara who got hold of me at short notice to take part in this. And I would like to now share my screen, and I've never done this before, but we'll see what happens when I press the green button there. I think I'm allowed to now. Is that coming in? Are you seeing my screen?
Not yet, no. Share your screen, and then I think you need to click on the screen that you have. Do a double click, and then it should come up.
And there's a blue button that says share, and when you click that, it'll start sharing.
Share, okay, right. I see that.
Yes, it looks like.
Okay, now we're on the way. Right, all I need to do is to enlarge it and get rid of everything else. Right, now I was asked to speak about carbon, but when I listened to everything here, I felt that I'd make it a bit more personal and talk about my concerns, and it brings together almost everything that we have seen in this festival so far. Joel, thank you for doing the introduction just now in your songs, because as you can see on the screen, my talk is about laments and about hope. So I really appreciated those two songs that gave us an introduction to the theme. My biggest concerns in this entanglement, as some people said yesterday, are climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and the indigenous peoples. So I'm going to start with the lament side of it, and then we'll go on to hope. These are two of the books that I edited. You just mentioned that I'd edited several books. Well, look at the titles. 1977, published Extinction is Forever. And this was about our loss of species of the world. And I brought together a big group of scientists, and we lamented what was going on in 1977. In 1986, in Washington, D.C., I coordinated a symposium called Tropical Rainforests and World Atmosphere. And that was about climate change in 1986. Now, I am very sad, I lament, that Have we gone very far since then? Not enough. There hasn't been nearly enough progress. And I am glad that the theme that has come out here on this conference has been urgency. I think that came right from the very start from Jonathan Porritt, that the whole situation is urgent. That means it's a big burden on us at this time. Well, look at the things that have happened in those areas that I am concerned with. I think these are familiar. I don't need to go into the details of climate change, the loss of biodiversity and indigenous peoples, but I do draw attention to the one at the bottom middle, which was published 2 weeks ago by the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew in their report, The State of the Plants and Fungi of the World. It's a good summary, and it's available online if you want to look at it. And one of the conclusions on it is that 2 in 5 plants are estimated to be threatened with extinction. So these plants upon which we depend are going extinct. Above is an animal that I've had the privilege to see in Costa Rica, but it is now extinct, the golden toad. Then in my work, inevitably, I've spent quite a lot of time with indigenous peoples. And look at the top right-hand graph and the area in orange. Those are the number of indigenous leaders that have been assassinated since 2007. It is going on around the world, particularly in Brazil and Indonesia at the moment. And each time we lose one of those, we lose a whole body of information. And then look down below when you see gold miners in indigenous territory of 3 tribes in Brazil, including my beloved Yanomami, with whom I have spent more than a year living amongst. And it's much worse than in this graph, figures from 2019. There are bigger invasions of those. Now, we could add to the graph at the top, COVID now. Those are assassinations by landowners and big companies who've arranged it. But on top of this, we now have COVID that is infected because they have little resistance. And so people like various chiefs have gone extinct, have been died. Chief Aritana and the wife of a chief I know very well, Raioni, have both died of COVID. And so that is another problem. But I don't want to dwell on the lament too long. You have done that well in various presentations. And I also think that during this festival so far, you've given us hope, as Joel just did now. So this is something that has taken me through all this sad time of watching the forest disappear, of seeing the Indians and the Amazon decline. It has been my faith. And so I put these 2 verses up for you to lead us into a time of hope, and think about this for the rest of my short talk. So I leave you particularly that text from Jeremiah, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. I think that is a good motto for what we have been talking about in this festival. And I just hope that we can take that home and work towards giving that hope. So we begin with hope for the climate. And some of the hope measures I see are small. At the top, you see the roof of my house, and you see hot water heating, and you see photovoltaic. This is a small thing, but that and my wood pellet boiler have reduced my carbon footprint enormously. We all need to do that. My church, Lyme Regis Baptist Church, has got photovoltaic on its roof. That's one reason why it is now an eco church, a silver eco church. But that is a small thing. We need to get much larger in our transformation of getting rid of fossil fuels. On the 6th of October, as you see, Prime Minister Boris Johnson promised a revolution in green power generation, with every home powered by wind. We're rather on the way for there. So we need this large scale, but you can see what I put below. Let us hold him to it. We've had good talks about political influence. In fact, yesterday, one that gave us hints of how to go to our MPs. And that is good advice, that contacting, writing, if we really want bigger change to happen. And I put this one in about vehicles that don't use fossil fuel. The blue car there is in India. Just recently, I had the privilege of traveling in a hydrogen-powered car, fuel cell car, in an aerodrome in the UK, an experimental car of Toyota. It was great fun driving across an airfield in this, but it was also hope and joy, because out of the exhaust was dripping water, and it's using hydrogen. I personally feel there's a greater future in hydrogen power for our vehicles than there is in electric, but I put an electric one down below. Currently, I only drive a hybrid, but my next car will be certainly completely electric. And my daughter and son-in-law each have fully electric cars now. I'm proud of them because they generate the power for to charge their cars in the photovoltaic on their roof in Plymouth. We can do these small things and they mount up. I now put on the Svalbard seed bank. This, in a way, bridges the gap from getting rid of fossil fuel to biodiversity. This bank was built in Svalbard because it is a permafrost area to hide the seeds for the future of crop plants. At Kew, we have a seed bank for wild species. This is for crop plants, but the two collaborate with each other. But the interesting thing is that in 2019, the bank in Svalbard was threatened because the ice began to melt around the entrance and water was trickling down that corridor into the seed bank. So they had to do emergency work on it. So here because of the permafrost, we're trying to put seeds where nature keeps them cool. And so we don't need to spend a lot on refrigeration, but climate change is affecting that. So that's rather an anachronism that where we put those seeds now, it is affected by climate change. Well, from that, we can go into some hope for biodiversity. This is a reserve in Brazil, only an hour's drive from Rio de Janeiro, called the Reserva Ecológica Guapiaçu. I have been involved with it since it began, when a student did a study of birds on a farm that was half forest and half farmland. And the result of it was that the farmer gave 500 hectares to form a reserve because of the bird list that that student had made. That was 15 years ago. Now, through the help of many people, including the World Land Trust, we have bought bits and pieces, and this reserve owns over 5,000 hectares, and it takes care of 8,000 hectares now. You can see in the top right that the nursery where we're planting trees, and the photo in the middle is a reforested area. Rewilding is so important today. And about half the land that we bought for this reserve was pasture, and about half of it was forest. You can see the mountains behind. The reserve goes from about sea level to 2,000 meters. So that's why there's such a wonderful richness of birds and plants. But it needed to be reforested as well. In the bottom right, you see a very young, the beginning of plantings, all native trees. If you want to go and see it, when one can travel again after COVID, in the center at the bottom is a lodge. We bought an old farm, restored it, and this is for bird watching and ecotourism, and that's giving the income of running this reserve. So it's paying for itself now from ecotourism, or it will again when we can travel, and it is restoring the rainforest in the Brazilian Atlantic rainforest, which only has 6% of the original forest left. So what more important area to rewild than this? So I have hope when I see how one student starting his doctoral thesis there has led to a very important reserve that is forming a corridor between two other reserves. So the small here is turning into large. I was very distressed a month ago when President Bolsonaro, the Trump of Brazil, repealed the legislation protecting the mangroves around Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. He said, these are in the way. Mangrove forest everywhere in the tropics is one of the most important forests in the world because it stabilizes coastline, it's full of fish, and it is the livelihood of many people just for its fishing. And I am happy, the hope is that Judge Maria Carvalho in October this year gave the order that stopped this, that blocked the moves to repeal the mangrove protections. We haven't talked in this festival today really about that part, the legislative part, and in several cases, there's been legislation from the courts that have gone against some of the destructions. And I see hope in that because this is actually not the only one that I know about that Brazil, where the judiciary has taken care of it rather than the politicians. I made 2 visits to Colombia last year before my travel stopped with COVID, and I had a lot of contact with the Colombian authorities because I was initiated as a member of the Colombian Academy of Sciences. But I attended a conference in the Amazon part of Colombia, and I worked in 2 botanical institutes in Colombia. But I was really overjoyed that they had a governor's conference in Colombia in May last year, and it brought together the governors of each state or province in Colombia, Peru, Brazil, and Bolivia. And those governors were discussing protecting their rainforests. The presidents of these countries are not, on the whole, good conservationists. But I saw that the governors are beginning to realize the importance of their forests. So they hope, and I'm keeping in contact with some of those, because I think there is hope for the future of the biodiversity of the rainforest through initiatives like this, and we need to encourage and support them. One of the things that is linked to climate change, to the protection of biodiversity, is food, because we can't isolate ourselves from the question that we need to keep our land to be productive in order that we don't cut down more land. We need to reforest some of the destroyed lands. So I'm in favor of people who are trying to make their land more productive. Here is a picture of an organic farmer in Sao Paulo, Brazil, Leontinho Balbo, and you only have to look at those statistics when you compare them with the destructive farms that I've seen. Most of his land is sugarcane. He has forest where you find puma and ocelots and maned wolves. And by going this way, where he's not burning off every year, he's getting 24% more sugar out of that land than the next door farmers in Sao Paulo. And the last area I mentioned that concerns me greatly are the indigenous people. I am very glad that several times in this conference, people have mentioned the importance of indigenous wisdom. Jonathan Porritt certainly began us with that, and he talked about the wisdom of Thomas Berry. Wonderful man. I too think that he has contributed a great deal to the environmental movement and the ethics of the environmental movement and the religious aspect of it. But one of his points was the importance of indigenous wisdom. And I think several other speakers also mentioned this. Cleo Lake, Melanie Nazareth were two of the others that talked about this. So I was glad that some of the people in this festival have been thinking about indigenous wisdom. And some of the wisdom is making the land more productive without destroying the land. So here's an example on the left from Costa Rica and on the right from Borneo. Indigenous peoples around the world are managing the land much more sustainably. Why haven't we learnt? I spent a lot of time with some of these people and seen they cut down a small area of forest, but then they manage it and they have very highly productive land that feeds enough people. We need to learn to have mixed cultivation, like that one in Borneo that you see on the screen. This is a hero, the president of the Guarani of Ecuador, Nemonte Nakimo. She was featured in Time magazine very recently, but she is from the Guarani. Now, some of you may remember the Auca and the 5 missionaries that were assassinated when they tried to establish contact with the Guarani, and how Rachel Saint, the widow of one of them, went back. The Guarani, many of them are now Christians, but what they're struggling with is the loss of their land by petroleum companies. So Nemonte went to the courts about it. So here is another example of a lawsuit which she won to protect the ancestral territory in Ecuador. What a wonderful state of hope that that is too. So I see that even with the loss of indigenous people and their culture, there are great signs of hope. And I'm delighted that Green Christians and other Christian organizations are doing things to be part of this contribution. This list of different organizations, which I'm sure you all know, is an important one because it shows that the church is waking up. We've discussed this quite a lot during this festival, and I would just urge you to keep in touch with these organizations and help to go on. The top right-hand corner is the roof of our church hall in Lyme Regis. You can see the solar panels on it that are generating electricity and reducing our carbon footprint. And one of the reasons why we are a silver church. It wasn't easy. In fact, in one of the discussion groups that we had in this conference, I was saying how difficult it was to interest the congregation to start with. But once it gets going, there's an enthusiasm about it. So make sure that this is into your churches as well. Sign of hope to me is this beginning in the churches to do something about creation. I was 2 weeks ago invited to give the Harvest Evensong to preach at it in Winchester Cathedral, a eco-church, an eco-cathedral. And so I saw there an awakening of this Christian interest in things. But to end with, I want to take up this other theme that most speakers have in this festival, the importance of youth. I've had the opportunity to speak in quite a lot of schools, to work with children at the Eden Project in Cornwall. And I'm all for Greta and what she has done, because the politicians are still asleep and we need to shake them up. So those of you who in this meeting that have taken part, thank you for taking part in the extinction movement, because extinction, as we see in the recent report from Kew, is so real. The bottom photo is a photo taken 2 years ago in Manaus in Brazil. And that photo has in it some of my students, some of my grand students, and some of my great grand students. How it brings me joy that those students that in a course that I set up in Brazil in 1973 have taught others, and those others have taught others. And they're mostly working on environmental things and not gaining knowledge about the Amazon rainforest. We need to spend time with youth. Look at these children from Arusha, South Africa. Look at their joy where they're learning about plants. Or look at these children fascinated with a kingfisher and watching the man in the front ringing a kingfisher so that they can make observations about it in Russia, in the Czech Republic. All these things give me hope. And so I am at times in the phase of lamenting, at times I am hoping. But we can reimagine the promised land. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Ghillean, for this fascinating and very inspiring talk. It's right to begin with lament, I think, but then to move into our Christian hope and what we can do and what can be done. And you are a complete inspiration. And I love the idea of your great-grand students. I think that is absolutely marvelous. So, well, there are a lot of comments and questions. There's a bit of a conversation about energy in this country and car sharing and cars and roads and so on. But Ben, I'll just find the comment. Ben said to everybody earlier, we need to learn from the outlook of Indigenous people living lightly on the earth. And of course, that is something that Green Christian encourages people with. Living lightly on the earth is one of our disciplines in the way of life, community, one of our 4 disciplines, living lightly on the earth. So Ghillean, from your knowledge of Indigenous peoples and the Yanomami who you spent a lot of time with, what can we learn in your view?
We can learn many things. First of all, I think, is the fact that they are not gathering riches. Everything is shared. I have been in a Yanomami village when someone has gone out and hunted a tapir, which is a lot of meat. And you watch when it comes in and you see the hunter dividing it up and how that is given to everybody. Mm. And they are not gathering all the goods that we are. They're not gathering wealth. And I think something that we have discussed in several of the talks so far is the distribution, the unequal distribution of wealth in the world, or the ownership of land. The land is common in many of the indigenous peoples that I've been with. It is shared. And I think that the main lesson I've learned is that there's something wrong with the way that we accumulate so much wealth and that it is not distributed. We can't really truly feed the world until the food is properly distributed and everyone has their fair share. So I think that's probably the first and main lesson I've learned from all my work with indigenous peoples.
That's really inspirational, and it feels to me absolutely right, and it's at the heart of our Christian faith, isn't it? That everybody is made in the image of God, everybody is equal. There are some other questions coming in. I'll just find this one here. Sue Adney has said, what do you think about the crime of ecocide becoming a global tool to challenge countries, leaders and multinationals? Is this as Christians something we should promote and support? I think Sue's saying the making ecocide a crime that we can challenge countries, leaders and multinationals with. And is this something as Christians we should promote and support?
Well, there is a great deal of ecocide going on around the world. I think I'm not sure that we need a legislation about that, but just being a Christian and our sharing and our respect for creation, we should be against these destructive things that are happening all over the world. We should be opposing it. It is much of what you would call ecocide that's destroying the species of the world, and most of it is actually caused by large multinational corporations and greed. There's something wrong with all this going to the pockets of shareholders and destroying the forest. So in many ways it is a crime. And as I said, we are using the courts a bit more in the environment, and probably we need to use them a lot more.
Yes, absolutely. Mike Pepler has asked a question that's probably on everybody's mind, and this is how the whole conversation about driving and car use started. I mean, you showed us a hydrogen powered car, which is really inspirational, but also there were people in the chat talking about car use in the UK and so on, land being used for roads and so on. But Mike has come back to travel. How do we balance the inspiration and learning that can be gained through travel with the carbon emissions caused by it? He feels that there's a risk of exceptionalism if we take the view that travel is okay for us if we do it for a good reason, but not for somebody else going on holiday. So
you have hit there, Mike, one of my sins, I think, in a way, because I did fly before COVID around the world talking about the environment and trying to do things for the rainforest. And it is something that has worried me. I try to do what I can in this, and certainly I always offset the flights that I do with various organizations that are planting trees to put back the carbon. And I think that is absolutely essential to be doing that if you have to fly. I think we need to reduce it as much as possible. I was rather interested yesterday in a discussion from the lady from trains, and the discussion there about the statistics she gave about using trains and the increase in trains and the need for much more, it, in a way, even opens something about the high-speed train, which I've been very negative about because of its effect on biodiversity. But we need mass transport. We need simple transport, like bicycles and things. And so, Mike, you're quite right. Should we travel or not? I have taken the attitude myself that maybe I can do more by traveling if I offset my carbon than by staying at home. And I'm feeling that at the moment, having been since the last trip in December last year that I made to Colombia, being housebound, as it were, at the moment because of COVID, that I want to get out there and do some more of this. So thank you, Green Christians, today for giving me a chance to talk to 132 people at the moment.
It's brilliant, isn't it? I mean, this is wonderful for us too. There's another question that's come in about, well, several people have mentioned over the weekend about older people and how do we influence older people to act more. Enid has picked up on this. Somebody else picked up on it as well. So I'm not just singling one person out there. This is a thread. Enid says, yes, we need to galvanize the youth. Well, I think they're already galvanized in my view, but a lot of them are anyway. But the older people need to take action using their power, money, experience, and influence to save the world for their grandchildren. And I would add also for all indigenous species and peoples. We're responsible for so much of the harm. So it's time to take responsibility. How do we activate grandparents across the world to take collective action? I like the word activate. I think that's a very good word. How do we activate grandparents across the world to take collective action? And Ghillean, I don't know if you're a grandparent, but you're certainly a parent. Do you have any views on this?
I do, and as we've been going through this conference, I've been thinking about my two grandsons who are aged 15 and 13, and wondering what future they have because of what we're doing to creation. Now, that's an interesting question that you raise about older people. In my experience, those of us that were born before the war, as I was, believe it or not, and came out with the ration books and things, grew up with that, know how to be quite frugal in things. And so the older grandparents, I think, are easily convinced about this. My real worry is the generation in between, maybe the ones who are now between 50 and 30. There's a huge gap. It's that group, and unfortunately, some of that group are the ones who are in influential positions in companies, in politics, and so it's those that we really need to influence in some way. Someone asked me that question in another talk I was doing the other day, and I said, I don't know how we'll influence them, except that we have an enormous environmental crisis that really gets the message over to them. They're pretty serious already, but how much do we need to convince them that there is a problem and to change their habits?
Yes, it seems to me it is a matter of habit quite often, isn't it? And there's some research about how many weeks it takes to change a habit, you know, whether it's giving up smoking or, you know, going for a walk once a day or something. But these kind of entrenched habits of a lifetime are going to be much more tricky because there's so many of them.
Might be a good time to bring in an older person here.
Oh yes, okay.
Much loved member of Green Christian, was our chaplain for many years, edited our magazine, but most importantly for this session, Chris Walton, for many years with his wife Ross, ran an activity centre for children in Suffolk. where they introduce them to imagination and the natural world. And Chris has a point to make here. Chris, do you want to come in?
Well, that's very kind. Thanks very much. It's very good to be with you, sir. We have the same coloured hair. I was trying to work out the sort of age you might be, but you've not exactly humiliated me, but made me very humble when you said that you were born before the war. I was born after it, so I'm a great deal younger than you. However, we did have an outdoor education centre for children. We were seeing something like 3,000 children a year. Of course, the pandemic has stopped all that. And that's my question. The pandemic has stopped that, and with many, many such institutions and centres all around this country, and probably, I guess, other countries too. And it has been suggested that schools should not let their children, because of the pandemic, go on trips to centres like this for a week or whatever, which does mean that a centre like ours, my wife and I have only just retired from it, but may indeed have to close down. And the way I wanted to put the question was this, giving that introduction is, I don't expect a direct answer, but maybe you could talk around it. If I were to start up a petition to say that the government and everybody else must do something about keeping such institutions going, what would you say, sir?
I would say amen to start with, because those are so important. I am a biologist. Yes. Because I had the privilege of growing up in a very wild area for some years in the Isle of Skye, then moving to the Cotswolds, but in a house that was a quarter of a mile from any other house, and having two aunts who were very, very keen amateur botanists. And I know from personal experience that the influence on children are very important. I see that with one of my grandsons, who has now become crazy on fossil collecting, because, as you know, I live in Lyme Regis on the Jurassic coast, took him out hunting fossils, and it caught on. And he has that passion now. And I've seen so many other children in the education programs at Kew, at the Eden Project, how they're influenced. We mustn't stop that. I have had my whole career working in botanic gardens, the New York Botanical Garden, the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, and the National Tropical Botanic Garden in Hawaii. Now, all of those have education programs for children. And nearly all the botanic gardens of the world are in cities, surrounded by bricks and mortar concrete. And when you see the programs that bring children in who have no other opportunity to see it, you see how important the work of botanic gardens are. So I would be very supportive of what you're doing, and of any petition that you might raise on this.
Well, that's absolutely wonderful. I'm going to work on the petition early this week.
Good.
Thank you.
Keep going.
That will be a good outcome, Chris, from this festival. You get one going. Everybody who's come on this festival, you will all sign that petition. Amen. And send it out to all your congregation, all your friends. So Ghillean will get it going around all his contacts at Kew Gardens, nationwide and worldwide. There you go. Get it going, Chris, and let's have the contact, have the details. Right, Deborah, over to you and back to the chat.
Yes.
Thank you, Chris.
The comments and questions are coming in thick and fast. Let me just see here. There's been an interesting little tiny thread about permaculture. And so my question about that is, the people you have spent, the indigenous people that you've spent time with in the Amazon, do they have a concept of growing crops, or is it really hunting and gathering, or how does it work? Or do they have an idea of permaculture? and planting and that kind of thing? I think we'd all be very interested to know that, Ghillean.
I'm all for permaculture to start with, and particularly in developed countries, because one of the worst things is the loss of soil worldwide. And soil is so vital. It's a living thing that full of organisms, and we're destroying it. Now, the Amazon Indians, originally, many of them were hunter-gatherers, not growing crops, but gradually I think many of the tribes do grow crops, particularly fruits and cassava. They do a lot of the foraging in the forest, but also the original population of the Amazon, for example, lived beside the rivers and managing the areas that were flooded by the river annually, and so got refertilized. In came Western civilization and destroyed those riverine populations that were huge and sent them inland to areas that they didn't know how to manage. And some people have tried to copy the Indians and use the floodplain area because of the annual fertilization. And so that is, to some extent, a permanent culture. But the permaculture is not something that is part of the indigenous people I know. They cut down a small area of forest, then they grow their crops for a few years, and then let it regenerate. And because it's a small area surrounded by forest, there are all the seed plants, there are all the organisms in the soil nearby, and it regenerates and it's forest again very quickly. Much of the Amazon forest that we see and admire and think is virgin forest has at some time in the last 10,000, 12,000 years been cut down. I've dug soil pits in quite remote places in the Amazon and found charcoal in the soil. Deep down, charcoal that's probably come from, because at some time it was a village was there. One of the other interesting things that is permaculture, scattered throughout the Amazon region are areas called Terra Preta dos Índios, translating the Portuguese, that is black soil of the Indians. There are these areas of extraordinarily rich black soil in an area that is known for its very poor soil, as most of the Amazon is. And these are all of anthropogenic origin. And they have made this soil by discarding by composting and getting a lot of charcoal from their fires. And the secret of the Indian black soil is charcoal. Nowadays, permaculturists are talking about biochar as something important. But the nearest thing to permaculture I've seen is this Indian black soil. People long to get a territory, a piece of land, the settlers, that has this Indian black soil because it is just so fertile, but they're using it like we do in our society. We use it till it's gone rather than manage it like the Indians did.
That's very interesting. Very interesting. I'd love to know more about that sometime.
There's a lot of literature about it. So if you look up Indian black soil, you can certainly find quite a bit. Long time ago, there's a paper of mine on it in the journal Acta Amazonica.
That's very good. So I hope people are noticing that there's a lot of literature out there that we can probably find on the internet about Indian black soil. There's several comments coming in about children and grandparents. Paul Bodnam says the strongest case for government support for outdoor centres is that without them, all learning goes virtual and children will use the crucial experience of immersion in nature and we risk a generation who are even more detached from nature than us. And then Jenny Cook has a lovely idea. Can we also crowdfund to support environmental centres for young and old? So it's not just, so it's also bringing communities together. So I'm going to move.
Yes, both of those are good ideas.
They are, aren't they? Yes. I'm just going to go on. Ellen Teague has asked, look, actually, I'm just going to say, Kate Rigby asks you, and I'm going to put two questions together. Kate Rigby says, could you say more, Ghillean, about the way that your faith might have helped you to be resilient in the face of your knowledge and experience of dreadful loss? And Ellen is asking, what religious leaders give you hope, and how would you assess Laudato Si by Pope Francis? So it's two questions together, really. Those are important questions. Certainly, personally, my faith has helped. It has encouraged me to go on with this, and as I gave you two texts of hope, but there are many other inspirations for hope in the Bible. Personally, I've had various experiences where I might not have got through without faith. There was a time when in one of the remotest places in the Amazon, I came down with malaria. And it was on an expedition where we were going up one river, going to portage across the watershed to another river and come down it again. So you can imagine how remote that is. We got to the end of the first river, already having sent back 2 members with malaria. And then it was my turn to get malaria. And as we were there to carry all our equipment out, it ended up that I spent 4 days gradually walking out from that place, but with malaria, coming at various times and having to put up my hammock and sleep off the fever. And the person who was sent to accompany from my field team got malaria and got it worse than me. Halfway along there, we got a mule coming to rescue us, and I ended up leading him on the mule because he was worse than me. So by the time I got out to the roadside, I was collapsing, but I can remember lying down there several times and thinking, I can't go on, over and over again. And then at those times, praying about this. And I'm sure the strength to do this, to get out of that one, was just because of my faith. It's amazing what you can make yourself do when you've got that faith behind you. So I thought that that's an example of it. Now, the other part of the question, which was a good one, was about Laudato Si. Wonderful document. I have used it, quoted it many times. I have a copy of it on my desk, and I was overjoyed by it. Now, the thing I admire about it is not only that it's a strong environmental message, but also that it is on good science. I know some of the people who went to the Papal Academy to contribute to some of the science to that document, well researched. And so my enthusiasm for it is someone who has such a large following as the Pope puts out such a wonderful thing on care for the earth. Thank you, Pope Francis. Keep up the good work. And that's not the last one. He's gone on with several other good statements about creation care. Mm. I completely agree with you. I think it's wonderful.
It's been a great
thank you.
influence. And Deborah, I'm going to bring in one more of our team. Our festival team, Isabel Murdoch, is going to come in with a question next, and then we'll go back to Deborah and the questions from chat. Isabel, can you bring yourself in?
Hello. Yes, well, something that I've been really struck by over the festival weekend has been the importance of what might seem like relatively small acts to change things or to demonstrate change on a small scale. Something I've been reading about recently is the idea of mini forests, which can be just the size of a tennis court, but can be high in biodiversity. And I was wondering what you think of these. Do you feel they're worthwhile? Are they just a drop in the ocean? Or are they even too interventionist rather than leaving a small patch of land like that to develop in its own way?
I think in general, small forests are very important. One of the things that has conserved quite a lot of species where things are surviving are sacred groves. There are wonderful sacred forests in Ethiopia. I've seen them in India and in Bangladesh. And those are examples of this attached to religion very often. But wherever small patches of forest like that, they can do some good. But my hope is that we can join them together. The other thing that is important, it really hasn't been mentioned in this festival so far, is corridors, how you link one small forest to another, and then it becomes larger. That's what we're doing in Regua, the Brazilian reserve I showed you. We're joining up different areas together. And if we don't have the small forests, we can never join them up. But it's surprising how a small piece of forest is a rest for a migratory bird. It's quite amazing the unusual birds that turn up in a little patch of forest in London at Kew Gardens or in other cities. These are important rest places for them. And whether it's rural or urban, small patches of forest are very important. So don't be put off them.
That's super, and that's really super, because it leads me into well, there's been various threads that have come together in, I think, in what you're thinking about right now, as well as permaculture in developed countries, which you've mentioned. And Mike points out that permaculture is much more productive for food growing than monocrops, and also much more effective for biodiversity. There's also the rewilding movement in the UK and other developed countries. And David Pattinson talks about urban biodiversity. There's quite a bit of it, but there's also a lot of paving over of gardens. And what can we do to encourage greater action to improve urban biodiversity without our neighbours hating us for perceived messiness in our gardens? I tried a kind of permaculture approach in an allotment I had one year, or for several years actually, and my neighbour was itching to tidy it up because he had the serried rows of carrots and onions and so on, and he just couldn't bear it. Anyway, what do you think about all of those? Well, there's a lot of questions there. There's rewilding and also urban biodiversity without our neighbours.
You'll be interested to know that my daughter, who lives in Budleigh Salterton in Devon, is keen on permaculture. And she has a garden that had rather a lot of paving stones in it. And last weekend, she and her husband were taking out paving stones and building a spiral for herbs, starting the permaculture in a small garden in Budleigh Salterton. What the neighbours will think, and what the lady who designed this garden with some rather important plants from whom they bought the house will think of my daughter's plan for permaculture, I don't know. That's her problem, but I'm proud of it, and I will support her to the hilt in doing this. And interestingly enough, the example from the sugarcane, organic sugarcane that I showed you, was taken from the magazine Permaculture. And that is a very good magazine that I can recommend to anyone who wants to learn more about permaculture. There is a magazine called Permaculture, and it's really good stuff.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I think we've just got time for a couple more questions. Alan, David Beattie, who asked the question about biodiversity in gardens, said, Alan Titchmarsh has said there are two sorts of gardeners, good gardeners and tidy gardeners.
Well, Alan Titchmarsh was trained at Kew, so of course he's a good gardener.
Brilliant gardener, yes. Alex and Ethan are here, and they are asking questions of both Sir Ghillean and Chris. They say, we are a young couple looking to change career from teaching and ecology to full-time engagement with a community, particularly young people, about the environment, and what would be your advice? So who wants to go first? Ghillean or Chris? Chris
is field.
Chris,
Yeah.
can you unmute yourself? Somebody, there you go.
I would quickly say that if they get in touch with me, we can have a good talk about that. But I'm just not in the moment, because Ross and I were at that place for 20 years. We left 3 years ago, and now we have resigned in order to give people who are taking over space from old people who say we used to do it that way. So we're trying to free ourselves from that, but I'd be very interested in conversing with them, and we could certainly help them. So if someone could give them my email address, then let's have a conversation. Let's do it this week, not sometime, but this week. Monday.
Well, happily, it's half term, so maybe that's a good time to do it.
Excellent, very good.
Excellent. So Ghillean, what would you say?
My advice to them is do it. We need to influence young people at the moment, and we need young people who've been trained, not just going into it without the knowledge. And so if you can really help to influence them, that is a very good thing. There are quite a lot of organizations where there's possibility to get a job, I think, even in this time. So go for it.
Yes.
That's fantastic, isn't it? I'd say go for it as well, Alex and Ethan. I think that's amazing. Wonderful. Okay, let me see what else. Let me see. Well, there's one question I want to finish with, but I will leave that for now. So I think maybe just a couple more. We're doing quite well on the questions. Keep them coming. Well, just another couple. Let's see. There's Hs2. Hs2 has popped up several times in this conversation this morning. But I'd like to link that with wildlife corridors in the UK as well. So Ghillean, do you have any thoughts on those two things which might be combined?
On Hs2 and?
Wildlife corridors.
Yes. It was interesting in the talk about railways yesterday in the discussion. She did mention the railways as corridors, and that is certainly a possibility, and some things do use them. Certainly, it depends on the management, and stopping the railways using toxic chemicals, for example, otherwise it would not be a corridor. Hs2, I never thought there was the need to get so many people from London to the north, but maybe there is from the data that we were given yesterday. Certainly, the trains are getting more and more overcrowded. The one thing that didn't come up in that discussion about trains is the cost of traveling by rail. I know someone who travels very regularly from Edinburgh to Plymouth, to Exeter, and it was until Flybe went under, much cheaper to fly than to use train. Now, there's something wrong with our system when it is like that. And this is, in a way, reducing who can afford to use the eco-way to travel. Some of the abandoned train lines that were discussed yesterday that were cut out by beaching. On one hand, I'd be very glad to see the station in Lyme Regis come back. But on the other hand, I've spent quite a lot of time walking along old railway tracks. In fact, the other day, one just near Budley Salterton, and have seen how those are corridors for wildlife. And I think that each one that might be considered for this needs an environmental impact by experts to see whether to put the one thing against the other, need for group travel from a place compared with what has taken over the old railway cuttings, because some of them have some really good plants and animals in them now. So maybe we shouldn't. I'm quite glad that the one I used to go to school on in Gloucestershire, from Winchcombe Station to Cheltenham, is a steam railway that is a tourist one now. But as the track is all there and it's used, that one is one that it might be good to revive into commercial, from Cheltenham to Honeybourne, for example.
Thank you. Right, I want to finish on one thing, but there's just time for one very quick answer, and then a sort of comment, which would be wonderful for everyone to consider. So the last question with a very quick answer, if you don't mind. If there was one thing, says Matt, if there was one thing we could all do over the next 6 months to progress this agenda, what should we do?
Pick one of the items that that is important locally where you are and get in touch with your MP.
Thank you.
That probably would be one of the first things I'd say.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I would agree. If people don't know, Ian Christie, who works for, I can't remember who he works for, but he came and did a workshop with Green Christian some years ago, and he said exactly the same. And he said MPs take notice of significant numbers of letters. So of course we all wanted to know what a significant number was, and he said 20. It's not very many. It just shows that people are thinking about these issues, and the one person who bothers to write is representative of a whole load more.
That is correct. I've heard that from MPs directly, that 20 letters they'll worry about it.
That's brilliant, isn't it? 20, it's not very many, and there's loads of us here. And finally, just one last thing, which is a lovely idea. I'm sorry, I didn't make a note of who asked this question, but it's super. Could Green Christian enable Sir Ghillean to produce a film along the lines of Sir David Attenborough's films to raise awareness in Christian circles of what needs to be done from a Christian perspective? Sir Ghillean's images and stories are inspirational. So
that's an interesting idea.
It's something for us to all think about, isn't it? But yes, to get into the churches, that would be brilliant. And as a lifelong Christian, you do have influence there. I think it's exactly 11:30. So I just would like to say thank you so much for your time this morning and for this very this rich session with so many themes. And we've thrown all sorts of questions at you and you haven't batted an eyelid. And thank you so much for that. So over to Barbara, I think now.
Just reiterate my thanks to Deborah's. That was absolutely wonderful and inspirational for us all in our almost final session. So thank you so much for being with us. Now we have a 30-minute break now. You come back